Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Vinícius Rodrigues Vieira. I'm a member of the research group in IP, International Political Economy, Variants of Democracy and Decarbonization. It's a great pleasure to introduce this talk today, uh, whose main speaker is Professor T.V. Pope from McGill University. The talk, the roundtable, is entitled Great Power, Competition, and Regional Orders, Past, Present, and Future. We also have the honor to have here for introducing the talk Professor Lourdes Sola, who's the leader of our research group, former president of IPSA, and senior research professor at the University of São Paulo in political science. We also have the honor of receiving Professor Eduardo Viola, who's in the back. He'll be here in a second. He will also make a brief presentation based on the topic after Professor TV Pole's talk. Let me talk a little bit about TV Pole quite briefly. He is a former president of ISA, International Studies Association, which is the main association in our field. It was between 2016 2017, and he's a prominent scholar in the field of IR theory, has written quite prolific about issues related to balancing security, institutions, pretty much all that is relative to our discipline regarding security issues and institutions. We would like, therefore, without further ado, to pass the word to our speakers today. In the order, we'll have Professor Lourdes Sola introducing with further detail what we're going to do today, and the members here of the round table. Then I pass the word to Professor TV Poe. Would like to talk for around 30, 40 minutes. I think that's fine. Then afterwards, Professor Eduardo Viola, who's just coming here, he will talk for other 30 minutes, and I will make comments afterwards, and of course, open to questions, including to those who are watching us through streaming. So, to contextualize a little bit, we are living the context in which the Russian war against Ukraine has been the landmark kind of critical juncture that marks the end of a long period of peace between the global powers, and there's the beginning of a new Cold War. Even though there is a different configuration of power in contrast to what happened during the first Cold War between the United States and the former Soviet Union, there is again a competition among great powers, and that has been shaping international politics. How those new conflicts affect the regional stability, and which are the tools that we have to understand under theoretical and academic terms in general, those new dynamics and impacts of those systemic rivalries. They are some of the questions that must be answered in this new scenario. So now I'm the honor to pass the word to Professor Lourdes Sola. So please, thank you very much for attending and for introducing the talk in more depth.
Bom dia, é prazer receber o professor Paul. Professor Paul, I must it's an honor, great honor to have you here. I hope it's just a introductory, yeah, an introductory moment, and you come, and you are able to come to stay a bit more. So I am very, very, very honored. We are all very honored and very interested in your work. But I'm really, I will restrict myself just to introduce you in Portuguese for apologizing for the fact that we are really in holidays, vacation, so that most students and colleagues that might be highly interested in your talk are not here, but I'm sure that they will either follow or be able to reconnect later on. So, professor, eu vou resumir em pouquíssimas palavras aquilo que o Vinícius já introduziu. Professor T.V. Paul é James McGill Professor de Relações Internacionais, é especialista em relações internacionais, em teoria, especialmente segurança internacional, regional e sul da Ásia. E ele foi, além de eleito do Royal Society of Canada, já foi presidente da International Studies Association. É longuíssima a lista de publicações, a produção, e eu não vou citar, mas ficará à disposição de todos mais tarde. Eu gostaria, então, sem muita elaboração, voltar a insistir que nós teremos também a honra de ter o professor Eduardo Viola, que é um dos nossos especialistas em relações internacionais e que enfrentará essas questões de uma ótica talvez distinta do TV Paul. Eu não tenho ideia, não sei o que ele vai dizer, embora possa prever, mas de qualquer maneira nós temos aqui digamos assim, um bom exemplo dos interesses que são muito relevantes, não apenas para o nosso projeto, mas que me parecem também muito relevantes para a análise da conjuntura internacional e doméstica atual, especialmente considerando as últimas publicações do professor Paul, que é sobre paz. Muito obrigada, e eu passo ao...
Okay, so before we start, like Lourdes said, what TV Paul is going to present us today, along with comments by Professor Eduardo Viola, are related to the current conjecture. So it's really useful to think not only in pure theoretical terms, but about what are the prospects for peace nowadays. Just before we start, those who are at home watching streaming, please send your questions. I say that in Portuguese. IEA responde tudo junto @usp.br. Repetindo, IEA responde @usp.br. Por favor, mandem suas perguntas. For those who may be from an English-speaking audience, I know that some network circles, they spread out to talk today in English, and it will be in English. Please send your questions, to IEA RESPON for Navy, DE@USP.br. Repeating, IEA-RESPON for Navy, DE@USP.br. Please send your questions, por favor. Enviem as suas perguntas, será um prazer todos aqui respondê-las. So without further ado, let me pass the word to Professor T.V. Paul. Thank you very much again for your presence. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Vinícius, for this kind introduction. And I'm honored to have the presence of Professor Sola and Professor Viola, and to be with you in this wonderful, impressive global city. First time coming to Sao Paulo, but before that I've been to Rio and Brasilia several times, and I haven't seen much, but it is quite a somewhat breathtaking how big it is. I mean, I come from India, so I know big cities like Mumbai and Delhi are all, but US is definitely special. I also have another connection to you, which is I am from the south of India, a state called Kerala. Many of you know that the Portuguese arrived there first and colonized us, parts of our coastal, and our pre-existing Christian community that's dating back to St. Thomas Christians, one of them, was divided by the Portuguese in the 15th, 16th century. So we ended up in the Catholic side, and actually my wife is from the Orthodox side, which is quite an impressive story. When the Portuguese introduced a lot of Catholic rituals and all that, tried to convert everyone, but half of the church did not. They resisted conversion. But now there is intermarriages, and, but their traditions go back to the Patriarch of Antioch. And our weather is very much like yours, the tropical parts. And there is another big connection, which is plant cassava or tapioca was brought from here to Travancore by the king of Travancore to save millions from famines. So you are remembered as the place where cassava came from. It's still talked about. Without that, people were dying because we get big monsoons and the food supplies were not good. And then there is rubber, which came to Kerala, which is a big part of even our own family. We have big rubber plantations. And a lot of other trees. I think you also got some from us. I don't know what all, but fruits and things like that. But clearly, people don't realize that this globalized world started with the European expansion. It was not just people to people only, it was also plants, animals, humans migrated, moved around. So I always found Brazil a very attractive place for us, an Indian coming originally, but I'm in Canada now, I'm a Canadian citizen. But we have a lot in common, the same desire for autonomy and independence and respect, status in many formal terms. So I'm actually just upselling when she's finishing up a book on India's status quest from Nehru to Modi. OUP New York is publishing it hopefully next year. But I'm more interested in my next projects are all on great powers. The term great power is a little problematic, but I just want to focus on. First of all, I am concerned about the lack of interest in IR, especially among our many younger colleagues, on this problematic of great power violence. Great powers are the most violent actors in international politics. Before that, of course, empires. Why I say that, there is interesting statistics Cal Holsti provided in his book about the 20th century. The biggest killer of 20th century, other than human caused or divinely caused diseases, was great power conflicts, either direct wars or indirect wars, proxy wars. And we have hospitals to deal with this problem of medical situations, but we have nothing similar to address this problem of great power violence. Why I say that? Because it's humanly created, and it's created by a small group of people in very elite positions, and we leave this to them. And this is a very traditional European understanding that these people are so well endowed with the knowledge and understanding of how to maintain peace. They are not. And they elect people like Donald Trump. And I must say, Mr. Biden is following that footstep by giving this weapon of cluster bombs to Ukraine, violating a taboo or a tradition. And they are a very small group of mostly men sitting in councils with their prejudices, their passions, their understanding of the world, poorly educated, but they have the instruments of violence, extraordinary violence in their hands. And they make choices that historically have produced extraordinary violence. And in one of those areas of violence are regional theaters, where they give the impression they are peace lovers, they bring peace, order. But do they? In fact, they create extraordinary conflicts in Middle East, for instance, Afghanistan, we know. They intervene with this passionate intervention, and then they exit without an exit plan, leaving the societies that they conquer in very terrible conditions. So I want to go back to history. What is the source of this great power violence in the regions? But my bigger project is actually also looking at when do they end up abandoning peace. They do produce peace, like Mikhail Gorbachev. Why do they abandon peace? And that is my other big project, where I try to understand their desire for status, positional status. They want to be top dogs. They want to be respected. And when they don't, and they have notions or norms of reciprocity, they expect others to reciprocate their gestures. When they don't get it, they become very angry. They become very angry, and then they try to use force wherever they can, not only to put the people second-ranking powers in place, but also to show to the other great powers that they are the top dog animals, top dog people, top dogs. I'm using the status terms. And it is this phenomena of great power violence is repeating, it's repetitive. We had a period of peace, relative peace, with the end of the Cold War. And then now we are entering a new era. And that era is, of course, led by the United States, NATO, European countries, and then you have the Chinese rise. And a number of other actors like India, like Brazil, like Turkey, and all in between, so-called pivotal states or rising powers, but not enough capability to challenge them. Luckily, they are holding up as much they can for maintaining their autonomy. Doesn't mean that they have come up with solutions to these problems. A bit like the non-aligned movement, the difference is the non-aligned did not have material capacity at that point due to the Cold War. Today, the so-called, I wouldn't term the non-aligned proper, these second-ranking states or pivotal states have more material capacity and more normative power too, which is another thing. Perhaps they are lacking leadership. During the non-aligned movement, you had Nehru, you had Nasser, you had Sukarno, a whole host of leaders who were willing to take positions very powerfully against the global leaders of the times. And starting with the Bantoon process, Belgrade conference, a number of initiatives, they tried their best to retain autonomy, failed many times because they were fighting each other and they needed the help of one superpower or other. So this project is actually an edited volume. We had a conference at McGill just before ISA conference in March, looking at great power conflicts and the new great power conflicts and their impact on regional orders. Basically trying to understand any difference between the past great power conflict, the Cold War, and the new Cold War, and how that's impacting regions. One of the starting point in this discussion is the contestation between two norms that have emerged in international politics over the past 200 years. And one is called spheres of influence norm, that's the great power interested norm. The other one is territorial integrity or sovereign equality norm, preferred by non-great power states. And this great power norm or desire for spheres of influence goes back, as everybody knows, imperial times, European great powers. But more prominently, the last 200 years, they have fought wars during the colonial period to maintain their spheres, sometimes expanding the spheres to such a level that the British thought they needed to protect Egypt to protect their Indian colony. And then of course the whole Anglo-Russian rivalry, again to protect India, the jewel in the crown. And so they consider their immediate neighborhood as their own, their sphere. Because what distinguishes a great power is the sphere. If you don't have a sphere, you are not a great power. And the sphere has to be recognized by others, other great powers, that's the peer group. And often the peer group has trouble recognizing. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So sometimes they make these deals, arrangements. So it's quite funny that the Portuguese lost the wars with the Dutch in India, but they allowed to keep Goa and a couple of other areas for the Portuguese. This was a great power deal and agreed by Britain later on, Dutch first, then Britain later on, and still continued until 61, of course, there was a takeover. So they have a French colony in India called Pondicherry, or had, now it is independent part of India, but still maintaining some autonomy there. People, French citizens live there, and then they can go back to France and come back. That's a deal that Nehru and de Gaulle made. So they had these deals. The Europeans had interesting deals, although they fought intense warfare on control of the other major parts. So Russia and China are rising powers. Russia pretend to be rising. Some call it declining. Some call it wannabe power. But we really know that it has this tradition of sphere of influence, and it sort of gave away that for a period of time, partly because of material weaknesses, and hoping that the Western countries would reciprocate. And now we know that the West gave them a lot of unwritten agreements, especially to Gorbachev, who naively accepted them, and then they changed the track. So NATO is expanding, and NATO is going to be now taking Ukraine, which will, I think, I mean, I'm going to be bold here, major mistake for international order. I mean, I'm a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainian people, because I hate the word sphere of influence, but I also realize that the Russians will never be happy with that decision. Yes, if they can defeat Russia and then transform that country into another Germany, Japan style. But this is a country that really into great power business. The average Russian thinks they are a great power. Everything is below all the other ideas. So the West is thinking they are going to bring peace to Ukraine. I am sorry, it is not going to produce. We can discuss this, whether it will produce peace. But then the question is how to protect Ukraine, which is a big challenge. I realize that as a sovereign state. So you have this sphere of influence problem. Then you have China, which, by the way, is probably definitely more powerful today than Russia or any other country other than the United States. And an expanding navy. Before they were not in the Indo-Pacific or as much. Today they're building so rapidly that the Americans are worried that their superiority, their backwater, the Pacific, would be overtaken somewhat soon by the Chinese. And the South China Sea, the islets they are building. But to their credit, they are maintaining intense economic relationship. This topic that you guys are very interested here. Whether it is a proof of the theory of interdependence that you can have a quasi peace when countries are interdependent economically, but no full peace, no Kantian peace, no perpetual peace. But clearly there is something that is preventing both sides from escalating as they have done on the Russian side. Russia was not part of the globalization process since the 90s, the new globalization. And as a result, Russia has still the traditional understanding. The Chinese are, of course, traditional in many sense, but they also want the trade going. That is a big difference from previous great power conflicts. And the Chinese are playing a Sun Tzu game, whereas Russians are playing a Clausewitzian game, direct flight. The Chinese are more interested in an indirect way of achieving their goals without a fight if possible. And they have achieved a lot, I must say. And it is a credit to them that it hasn't produced the violence that the European great power system produced for the past 200 years. So we can go over these things rather interestingly. So what's the difference between the previous Cold War and the new Cold War? What are the leading norms? What are the instruments of contestation? What are the institutional structures? What is the impact on regional orders? I don't have a PowerPoint, but I just want to say the Cold War, the first Cold War, 1949 and 1991, two leading norms, of course, spheres of influence, territorial integrity. They contested, but territorial integrity norm was preserved to some great extent. Even by the great powers, they broke occasionally, of course, interventionary wars. But there is an interesting article by Mark Sacker who talks about the integrity norm. Very few states lost their borders or their territories during that period, except towards the end, because of the lack of recognition by others. But sphere of influence was very clear. The Eastern, Western Europe, Japan, East Asia, and the United States and Soviet Union maintained that sphere to some extent, while preserving territorial integrity as much as they could. Instruments of contestation were balancing, hard balancing, proxy wars, direct interventions, containment, global as well as regional, selective and military aid. Then you have institutional structures, United Nations and the alliances. So what was the impact on the regional orders? Exacerbation of regional conflict and rivalries, negative impact on economic development. The reason why I'm saying is that, of course, there were some countries, East Asia developed, the East Asian miracle, even Latin America, a little bit of development here and there. But overall, Cold War was bad for the global South. If anyone says otherwise, I like to see some evidence. 40 million people died in proxy wars. I don't want to blame the great powers for all that. These are new states that emerged. They had their own reasons to fight wars. States emerged with borders, some of them created by the retreating colonial imperial great powers, rather stupidly, I must say, without thinking about the locations and the people. And then you think about the poor developmental strategies. They gave aid, often aid to the dictators, or people simply had no understanding of development. Some did make use of that, but that's a very handful. And so it was a period of, and this is not recognized sufficiently in the IR literature. If people can differ with me, I'm fine with that. But we are people, especially from the global South, when we write about these things, the northern scholars think we are, you don't understand international politics. Since both of us studied in Western universities, there is always this condescending look. What do you think of great power politics? Great. Yeah. So I have a problem with that because we in the global South need to focus on a little bit more without being angry. Just be good scholars, analyze the contributions of the Cold War, whether it produced the outcome that they were talking about. They talk a lot about stability, order, nuclear stability. I mean, I'm also a student of nuclear deterrence and all this, so I know what they're talking about. But the point is, it was a waste of time, resources, and it produced intense conflict and rivalry. Of course, it didn't produce a war, but why do we need to think about war all the time? They were preparing for, by the way, nuclear war all the time. They had enormous, first strike ideas that were, luckily, we avoided that. The immediate post-Cold War period is 1991 to 2014, partial territorial integrity norm, limited multilateralism were leading norms, and then you have instruments of contestation, limited bilateral multilateral cooperation, soft balancing is topic that I have written, use of institutions to restrain threatening powers. Limited hard balancing means military spending came down for a period of time. Now it is back to square one. Globalization mechanisms, quite a bit of institutional structures emerged. War on terror, that is after 9/11. Institutional structures, you had the United Nations, you had regional institutions, EU, ASEAN. New forums were created, BRICS, Brazil is a big member of that, and then G20 subsequently. So what was the impact on regional orders? Reduction in regional tensions except transnational terrorism induced conflict. Some attention to collective action problems. And then, of course, US-led unilateral interventions, military interventions, very poorly thought out, unnecessary in some instances, not always. I mean, Afghanistan maybe was a necessary war, but Iraq war, now we all know that even the Americans don't think, even George Bush, who initiated, doesn't think it was the right war. And then leaving that war zone to a middle income country, to one of the worst violent regions, just like that. Afghanistan, the same to some extent, it's beyond sometimes their control. But look at where it started. It was a Soviet intervention, 1979, that dragged that place, which we all know, the graveyard of empires, into a real graveyard of great power politics. And today it's worse than it was in many ways in the past. So I call the new Cold War let's put 2014, kind of Xi Jinping's arrival period, as the period. Now, sphere of influence is back, but still there is partial territorial integrity norm. There is hard balancing using military instruments and alignment among some of the lead participants. You have also soft balancing institutional structures. Economic statecraft is used quite a bit, coercion, for instance, technological denial, expansion, for instance, cyber, AI, etc. So we have institutionally weakened UN, weakened EU, weakened ASEAN, G20 still trying to find out its position, BRICS again weakened in many ways. I wouldn't call it anything but a good gathering place. Impact on regional orders, selected military interventions, economic sphere contestation, less attention to collective action problems. Of course, they meet at global meetings, places, but look at the trade sphere, look at the climate change. The urgency is not visible in their solutions they've come up with. And of course, there is quite a bit of military buildup going on. And of course, this does not mean that the new Cold War is exactly a replica of the past. What is interesting from a global South perspective is secondary states are navigating this order somewhat similarly to some extent. They are not falling into this trap of alignment, alliance building, or bandwagoning, as we call it in the discipline. During the Cold War, bandwagoning was a very common feature, which means you join the side, the aggressive side, for military or economic benefits, and then you support their military actions. That's how the alliances were created during the Cold War. Today, countries are reluctant, even in Central Asia, or where Russia's previous states, they are all reluctant to join Russia, for instance, or even Asia Pacific, Latin America. There is great reluctance to just join any great power for little goodies and go part of their wars. Of course, the Western alliance is staying on. Then, of course, you have the American alliances with Japan and with Australia, New Zealand. These are pre-existing alliances. They have their own reasons for that. But this change is something. The question is how long they can manage. That's why when they say we like a multipolar order or a multiplex order, as my friend Amitabh Acharya calls it, why do they say that? They like that because they don't want to be part of this great power contestation, military contestation. They have little to gain. They may get a little economic aid here and there, but they need kind of globalization. They need economic prosperity. They need support for their trade, technological innovations. They cannot become part of it by abandoning China or United States. So they are kind of non-aligned point too. But countries like India are part of the Quad, with hoping that if there is a war with China, they need United States. So this they did, by the way, during the Cold War also. They were part of the Russian side for economic and military reasons. But they are maintaining a reasonably okay relationship with Russia, and China is the challenge because of the territorial, increased territorial conflict. Now, there are a few countries that prospered during the Cold War. We know that, the East Asian states. But people forget that those who did are the ones who innovated internally. Good leadership, good states. So the NICs, the countries like Korea or Japan, starting with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and maybe Indonesia, some of those countries. But then you have the Philippines, you have Pakistan, you have Egypt. They all got a lot of money from these great powers during that period. But where are they now? So it's not guaranteed that great power money will go into the developmental sphere. Unless they are developmental states, getting into bed with great powers is not a great idea. Of course, it gives you some bombing monies for Pakistan gets from China today, or now IMF. But it is not clear it's going to help them a lot unless they have a good state structure to deal with this problem or deal with development. So we all know that the language of developmental states, what is required, the Chalmers-Johnson type of approach. How am I doing with time?
You're fine. Well, you have been talking for about 25 minutes.
Okay, I'll take another 10 more minutes. So the regional states or the second ranking states, what are their strategies during the Cold War? The first phase, alignment, non-alignment, bandwagoning, some soft balancing. Immediate post-Cold War period, hedging means they are trying to hedge their bets. Insurance policy, not doing anything any particular. Then diplomatic engagements, soft balancing, economic liberalization, war on terror. Some of them joined with the United States, for instance. The new Cold War, that's since 2014, you have hedging going on, limited hard balancing coalitions, but they are seeking strategic autonomy in general, which is quite an interesting phenomenon. Now, institutional mechanisms, they have the G20, BRICS Quad, ASEAN forums, BRI, another forum, Belt and Road Initiative. Many have joined, but not with the intention of militarily engaging, but benefit from the Chinese infrastructure. But interestingly, that they generate domestic politics, even in tiny states like Maldives and Sri Lanka. So the Chinese have been not always all that successful as you think. In Pakistan, there's a huge unhappy state because there's a huge debt that BRI and the CPEC, China-Pakistan corridor, has brought in. And they are trying to, but I don't want to reject BRI as a totally irrelevant. It is actually doing good for some places. Fast infrastructure development is happening. But as long as the Chinese don't militarize it, don't make it part of their grand strategy of military, seeking naval facilities or ports, they can continue for some more time. It doesn't mean it will continue. I think that those who study China know that their economy, their debt is increasing, their domestic debt. And many of these countries cannot pay back. But the point is, infrastructure is critical for economic development. Now, how many of these countries have the other capacity, the human resource, the technological capacity, and the political capacity or the peace to see benefit from that is questionable. That's Pakistan's. That's an extreme case. Same with Sri Lanka's, South Asia's cases. So what's the outcome of this particular phase? You have intensified regional conflicts in some areas like the Middle East. Decline in economic growth of some, but some have been growing, like India, I think. Increasing instability, less attention to collective action problems. You are lacking leadership, global leadership. The NATO meeting or the G7 meeting, all the clubs, they're not inclusive. And it's very hard to know how others will be following their positions. So this conflict that all of a sudden hit us with Russia's invasion, a major blunder on the part of Vladimir Putin. I think he was hoping that Ukraine will fold, won't resist. West would simply also don't do anything. But now it's becoming a protracted conflict, just like Afghanistan. There is a very likely chance that it will go on and on for at least a decade, because the West has no intention to stop it until Ukraine or Soviet or Russia withdraws completely, which he cannot for domestic politics. Russia has no intention of allowing Ukraine to become part of NATO. So what's the solution here? So there is a linkage politics, widening goals of parties, and then the introduction of weapons. And I just worry that the West adding more and more cluster bomb type weapon, and the Russians will have now justification for using limited nuclear bombs, so small scale bombs. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the point is they can now justify, if you're using cluster bombs, there is a ban on that. Why can't we use tactical nuclear weapons? Another big mistake of breaking that taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. So I think Russians will start at least using more and more nuclear threats because they don't have the capacity to conventionally challenge the Western supply. Although they are, at this point, they are not losing the war. They are maintaining. So it's a protract. Neither side is losing. There's no hurting stalemate. That's the big point. There's no incentive for peace on both sides. For Russia, for Ukraine, it is an existential situation. For Russia, it is also existential. By the way, if you think that your great power status is part of your existence and that it will be completely gone, that is existential war. Existential war is the worst for international conflicts, for protracted conflict. And when countries, I'm not saying from outside, we don't want to look at that way, but for a Russian immersed in this history of great power, status, and positionality, it is not clear they can afford it. Again, I'm not justifying. My starting point was this great power thing in their head that they are top dogs. Their positional power will be removed if they allow other great powers to take away their sphere of influence. We need to go back to our basic understanding of IR and try to see beyond this simple narratives that we hear about peace and conflict. I mean, you read that NATO statement. Obviously, it's all written by people who have they don't look at history in the way we do, at least some of us. And we need a lot more thinking on the behavior, the actions and reactions, the reciprocity that it produces, the non-reciprocity. There's a good literature on that. What produces peace and what produces conflict? So regional orders are, let me just conclude saying that we have the literature out there. Patterns of regularized interactions among states and between states and key non-state actors in a regional domain characterized by conflict, cooperation, and peace, or mixed patterns. In the Cold War, the IR literature, liberal, realist, constructivist, post-colonial, all have some take. I'm not going to go into that as you probably study in your courses. But one thing is very clear that they are focusing on stability, instability, whether it is warm, stable peace or normal peace, Cold War, hot war, etc. And different outcomes are out there. And what produces those outcomes in the regional context is very important. This project is also part of, I'm a part of a network called Global Research Network on Peaceful Change. I would encourage, we will probably talk about it, more participation from Latin American countries. It's an informal network. It was out of my 2016 presidential theme at ISA conference in Baltimore was on peaceful, on change in world politics. And so then I started taking some steps and with a lot of colleagues. It's now, there is a good web page called grenpec.com, grenpec.com. We have an Oxford handbook, actually a good resource base, some 41 chapters on peaceful change and regional, global, different dimensions, different theoretical positions. And not preaching in the sense, not all peaceful change is good. As we know, elections produced through peaceful outcome produce your favorite topic of populism and things like that. It's not clear all peaceful change is good, but even then we need to study. But one thing is very clear that many choices countries make are not producing peaceful choices at this point. So there is a maximalist as well as a minimalist position. But my aim in this project is to understand what great powers do for regions, whether these produce outcomes that we always think are peaceful or not. And what can we do? What can great powers recalibrate their policies to avoid intense regional rivalries and conflicts? Some are proxy, some are supporting their, regional allies. And whether this past pattern that we noticed will continue or not, and what are the future trajectories that we are entering. So that's sort of the larger purpose of this project. It's only one of the several projects we are doing. We have now another book project on international organizations and peaceful change, looking at many cases, some producing good outcomes, some not so, and the reasons for that. That's now under review, a series of papers. And this one is also an edited volume, which we are talking to another press. So the idea is to expand our horizon, trying to see whether these dimensions of conflict and cooperation emerge. What are the conditions? What the IR literature does. What is very clear, the IR literature needs a lot of work. We're still stuck in the European industrial era great power world. There is a reluctance on the part of the northern scholars to go beyond that. There are some, of course, do. And then there is a reluctance on the part of especially critical scholars, sometimes not paying attention to these other dimensions that produce conflict. So we need I'm one of the advocates of eclectic bridge building strategies. We need to talk to each other. We cannot just pass by and declare that our position is the only position. So it's time, this silo building, I'm trying to avoid that term, but it's coming up. We need a lot more thinking on this subject of great powers. That many people hate that term, great power. Why, what is so great about? Well, that's the term. I mean, we can call them leading powers if you want, but the point is they are the ones with the capability, intentions, capacity to engage in both conflict and cooperation and violence. Let me stop there, and then I'm sure we will have some discussion points. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, TV Paul, for your wonderful talk. And again, to repeat, those who are at home may send questions to IEA-USPONDE@usp.br. Em português, IEA-responde@usp.br. I propose that we refrain from collecting questions right now, as we also have yet to hear Professor Eduardo Viola. So the floor is yours, Viola, please.
First of all, I have a great pleasure to be here with Professor Paul, with Professor Lourdes Sola, and with Professor Vinícius. The other thing I would like to say is that I have major disagreements with Professor Paul. I think this will be very interesting for the discussion. Particularly, there are 2 points that I have major disagreement. First, in relation to what has been the role of the Western civilization. I think has been extremely positive, with, of course, negative elements, but very different from what Professor Paul thinks. The second point is in relation to the approach to the first Cold War. I think it was key, the alliances of democracies led by United States, but not with other countries that were not democracy, was key for something that for me is key in my approach. That is international relations linked to questions of values and political regimes. For me, it's key to relate these 2 issues. Another thing that is important to say is that, Professor Paul, is that my view is extremely minoritarian in the international relation communities of Brazil. So don't think that what my position is the okay. And the last thing before going is that historically my area of specialization is what I call now the international political economy of climate change and energy transition. but I have been always following the international situation. I have some publishing, not a small part that is related to the dynamic of the international system. Next one, please. Okay, so I will start with the drivers of the international system in 2023. This is a very superficial part of my presentation that is related to, those are things that are important as assumptions for me about the present world, the big power competition and so on. So, globalization slowed down. No deglobalization, okay? Digitalization of the economy. Demographic transformation, aging population and migration. This is very, very relevant because China is having right now the dramatic decline in fertility rate that is not going to be, they are trying to solve now, calling the members of the Communist Party to have 3 children, but this will not change, okay? It's a deep dynamic about the status of women, all these kind of things. Disruptive technological challenge. Generative artificial intelligence and synthetic biology. Social media and affective polarization. Growing cyber threats, pandemics, and global health. Crisis of democracy. There is an hypothesis that I think I wish would consolidate is that there is a reversion starting in 2022 of crisis of democracies, partial reversion. Strengthening of autocracies. Next one, please. Por favor, próximo. No. A ver. Yes, this one. We live in the age of the strong man. This is the title of a book published in 2022 by Gideon Rachman. It is a very, very important book, one of the most important books in the 21st century, because it's comparing strong men in democracies and strong men in autocracies. Crisis of multilateralism. This is very well known. I don't need to extend about this. New Cold War between United States, Europe, and Japan, and China, Russia. This is the New Cold War is between a collective Western and the alliance of autocracies. Growing risk of nuclear war. Why we are now in a period similar to 1948, 1962, in which there was a extremely risky, high risk of nuclear war. And no, there was not a regulated, let's say, approach to the conflict between the major parts. I follow the approach of Niall Ferguson, very famous historian and analyst of the present, okay, in which he says that we will be in an extremely risky situation until there is the equivalent of the detente initiated after the Cuban Missile Crisis and consolidated in the end of the 60s. Okay. Growing climate change. Well, this is, I don't need to, this is my specialization, but I I don't need to extend about this. The only thing is major data is that we continue growing emissions between 1 and 2% of the year. And another thing very important is that China is the major predator of mitigating climate change, despite the whole propaganda that they do, because they continue producing around 35% of the global emission each year. Okay, and of course there is they are deploying a lot of renewable energy, but they are continuous growing dramatically fossil fuels use. Okay, so this is the I mean the dynamic of this international environment, the international climate negotiations is, in my view, I am very pessimistic. Okay, so one thing is what's happening in reality, or another thing is the discourses. Today there are only two countries that are two areas that are reducing emissions: the European Union, that is the vanguard, the United Kingdom, and United States. In the case of the European Union and the United Kingdom, they have, this is product of policies, okay? In the case of the European Union, since 2007. In the case of the United States, it's product of technological breakthrough. It's the shale gas revolution that has reduced emissions since 2009 until now around 2% a year. But of course, with the exception of 2019, that there was some growth, and 2021 and 2022, unlikely 2023. Okay, the energy transition. This is something that is happening, and the major players of the energy transition and global corporations. Okay, most Western political collective Western corporations are introducing in their investments and planning decarbonization in different levels each country. But this is very relevant. This is what is happening in the world. Okay, these global corporations, of course, are very heterogeneous in terms of decarbonization, and of course, the oil corporations are not yet, at least, going in the direction of the decarbonization. That would mean to transform the oil corporations in energy corporations. All speak about that, but this is not happening. There is a major research published last year that shows that is about Western corporation and private corporations of oil, that they show that there is a major difference between going away from carbon and the discourse and the reality. Global deforestation and erosion of biodiversity. This is very well known in Brazil, of course. This is our major problem by far. And acidification and pollution of oceans. This is a very important issue that has been not present in the global debate until very recently. Okay. Próximo, por favor. Okay. are we in a bipolar or multipolar world? Is bipolar if we prioritize the military dimension with two alliances in confront, the NATO and collective West, that this includes clearly South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, that Taiwan is an exemplar democracy, is a country. I hope that never will be destroyed by China. For that reason, it's very important the increase of deterrence by the West. On the other side, a relative alliance, more less strong, but alliance without major treaties, let's say, among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Multipolar, if we prioritize if we prioritize the economic dimension, and there are the poles of this economic dimension is United States, China, European Union, Japan, India. Multipolar if we prioritize the political dimension. Multipolar if we prioritize the environmental dimension, where the major powers are United States, European Union, UK, China, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan. Why? Because they are the major shares of global carbon emission. Combining the four dimensions is more bipolar because of the alliances and the strong relationship between the military power and the economic power. Próximo, por favor. Evolución histórica. This is well known, but anyway. We have a multipolar world in the period 1815 to 1945. Of course, this came from before, but we have a big bipolar world in 1945, 1989, and we have a unipolar world between 1990 and 2008, and a relative multipolar world between 2008 and 2021, and again a bipolar world since 2022. Though the bipolar world was starting to increase, developing as I agree totally with Professor Paul, this bipolar world started to develop in 2014. The Second Cold War, similarity with the first one in why? Democracies and autocracies consider the other as existential threat. This is key why we are in a second Cold War. Okay? This is a major issue. Difference. The first without economic interdependence at all, the second with a strong economic interdependence. Another similarity. In both, there is a space for non-alignment or multi-alignment, but this is strong in the second than the first Cold War. The very used concept of global south, a mistake because there are deep differences in per capita income. We have in the global south high middle income countries, low middle income countries, and poor low income countries. And let's say the difference in per capita income between high middle income and low income is bigger than the difference between the high income and the high middle income countries. Okay, and the difference is also very big among some, not all, low middle income countries. And the other major difference is that the political regimes we have in the in the so-called global south, I don't agree with the conceptualization. I think it is a mistake, but it's very used. We have liberal democracies, electoral democracies, electoral autocracies, and following here the conceptualization of varieties of democracy that I agree, fully agree. Próximo, por favor. Decoupling and de-risking. Decoupling is happening very fast in dual-use technologies and sophisticated high-tech, particularly semiconductors and critical raw materials. De-risking in middle technology, no impact in low technology. Increased protection and state intervention all over the world. This is a major change from recent past. The major Western strategic mistake was to incentivize the ascent of China, supposing that gradually liberalize the political regime. Despite the vast benefits of globalization, the strategic outcome has been very negative for democracy. So, as you see, I didn't think that in 2000s, but I think that the strategy of United States of increasing interdependency with China was a major strategic mistake. But of course was very good for increasing productivity and for reducing international income inequalities. Próxima. How important are regional parties? This is an area where I have a lot of disagreement with Professor Ball. India, Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Indonesia are regional powers. India is by far the most important regional power because of military and economic power. This was very well presented by Professor Paul. I think that India is approaching more and more to Europe and United States, economically and militarily. Okay, so and one major player here are the corporations. Okay, the private sector, because of the Indian diaspora in the West. Turkey is an important regional power because it has the second bigger effective troops, bigger troops in NATO. Okay, after United States. So there are American bases in Turkey. Okay, in the south. Saudi Arabia is a regional power and a global power because it's an energy. It's a regional power in the Middle East, but it's a global power also because it's an energy power. And India is going in the direction of being a big power. Okay. Iran is an important regional power because of its military and energy power. Brazil is relatively weak regional power, but have two dimensions of global power, environment and food production. South Africa is extremely weak regional power. I don't know if I will call it, but I put South Africa. Indonesia is a weak regional power. There is not a trend to form an alliance among regional powers. This is very, in Brazil, a lot of people think that way. There will be an alliance of the regional power and middle power. I don't agree at all. Okay? There are subgroups. Of course, Iran is part of the autocracies alliance. And so finally, I would like to bring to you the immediate risks in 2023 by Eurasia, the global consultant that is, to me, a major reference for analyzing the world. but I don't agree with all the things. Jan Brimmer say that we are not in a new Cold War because the South powers could choose and not a non-ally. But this is also happening in the First Cold War. Okay. The Imperator Xi Jinping. Well, I don't need to extend about this. Weapons of mass disruption. Okay, this is particularly in this artificial intelligence and all the social networks and so on. Inflationary shocks. This risk has started to diminish, particularly because the dynamic of the American economy. Sitiate Iran. Pues, this is very clear also. The energy crisis, this is something that has diminished. I mean, the forecast was not correct, let's say. World development stop. This affects particularly low income and low middle income countries, except of course India. The disunited states of America. This is very, very important. Boom of TikTok in the West. A dynamic to restrain or prohibit. Okay. This, I don't think this is a very major risk, but it's Eurasia. And hydric stress. This is clear all over the world. Okay. Próximo. No. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am ready to take your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Viola. Thank you, Eduardo. So I will kick off the discussion by trying to build some similarities between those two quite opposite positions presented by Professor Paul and Professor Viola. And if you allow me, let me pose to both of you two main questions. I think the first point of potential convergence here for the debate lies in this analogy between the regional powers, the middle powers, no matter how we call them nowadays, like Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, for some India, although it's a nuclear power with great power ambitions, and the non-aligned movement of the First Cold War. Professor Paul, you mentioned that there is a lack of leadership nowadays, but does not the same apply for the late moment of the non-aligned movement? Certainly we had Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, other global South leaders, all the push for decolonization. But perhaps I'm departing too much from an institutional liberal perspective, but one of the main criticisms against not only the non-aligned movement, but any global South coalition, and in the sense I'm making dialogue with what Professor Viola has just mentioned about this lack of a common ground, is it not a problem for building alternatives or building enduring coalitions more than the lack of leadership per se, that is the lack of convergence points or the existence of too many points upon which there could be convergence, but at the same time disagreement? Is not it a problem for the so-called middle regional powers? And what is therefore the impact of that in the global order? In the sense, I'd like to push a little bit further. I'm so glad that you mentioned during your talk the complex of multiplex world by Amitav Acharya. By the way, there is a forthcoming special issue on international affairs. We are planning. I'm supposed to contribute to. Indrajit Roy, by the way, he's another colleague who may be here by the end of this month. He's doing the other way around. He will stop by here after Buenos Aires, the Buenos Aires EPSOM meeting. So I'd like that to push a little bit further. Is this multiplex concept an alternative to understand the potentialities of cooperation and therefore of multilateralism among global South countries. So that's my point here. And more focus on Viola's criticism, what I think is very nicely about the global South. If it's not a useful analytical category, it's a little bit provocative regarding your positions, but to what extent is it much better than simply dividing the world between democracies and autocracies, which seems to be a current way of dividing the world under your own perspective? Here I'm trying to provoke you a little bit about that, because certainly the idea of democracy of the West seems to be not the same even before the rise of the Hindu nationalists in India, although now India has quite huge overlapping, as you correctly mentioned, with EU and US, particularly in the context in which, for instance, the BRICS is reportedly trying to think of a new currency for trade, and India is reportedly vetoing or not joining that initiative that would be announced in the next BRICS meeting this August in South Africa. So to what extent, therefore, can we think of this world divided between democracies and autocracies instead of global North and global South, given that there is also too much heterogeneity among both the democracies and the autocracies? So that would be my comments, questions to kick off the discussion. And of course, those who are at home, please keep sending questions. Let me read here the email again. IEA responde, tudo junto, @usp.br em português. In English, IEA-USP.br. Please send your questions. So let's begin with the order of presentation with Professor Paul and after with Professor Viola. Thank you.
I actually really liked Professor Viola's presentation. I don't think we have so much disagreement, more agreement I see than disagreement. Maybe in semantics, or I didn't go into all the details as he has. Mine is more general and trying to focus on some broad categories. So I don't know whether we disagree that much. Neither of us mentioned this idea of liberal world order, liberal international order, and its decline. Or I think that's one thread that may be connected. We can connect in, I think, your categories of quasi liberal and autocracy, electoral autocracy. Those are very useful categories. But I don't think. Where I would disagree is the idea that there is a bipolarity existing in the military sphere. I don't see, not yet as far as I see. I don't think China-Russia relationship is anything similar to what we had in the Cold War. My reading is China is, both are suspicious of each other. This is an alliance of convenience. There is no military to military coordination. There's no Warsaw Pact. Even the China USSR, the first phase of the relationship was much more intense. Yes, there is some common positions, but have you noticed China does not want Russia to use nuclear weapons. China was extremely uncomfortable with the Ukrainian invasion, has not even recognized the takeover of Crimea by Putin. And a lot of differences there, but they are able to paper over quite a bit because of the common enemy, United States. So, yes, it could end up there, but it may not be as strong because of the competing interest of both Russia and China in the sphere of influence that is Central Asia. So, can they create some kind of a common understanding? But common enemies do. So NATO expansion and NATO's intensified activism could produce that. And simultaneously, Western intervention in Taiwan context or East Asia. But I am not sure that it is a second Cold War, like the bipolarity Yes, in terms of military capabilities, maybe if you look at China increasingly, but are they usable military capabilities? What exactly are they doing? Can you say that they are so critical for global order at this point? I think it's, well, anyway, one can discuss that. We may get into that, but I think it will be quite different if China wants to continue its relationship with the West, which is an economic relationship, technological relationship. Containment was complete closure of communist countries from the West, including technology denial to, that whole era, economic relationship, political relationship, that we haven't received yet. Yeah, of course, the Russian part is there, but even there, countries are importing their oil and all despite the sanctions. So I'm slightly on the disagreement on that, whether it is a bipolar system. It is more multiplex, I think, to some extent. There are all these points of, in fact, even your description of beyond the military, it's quite multiplex. But even there, I mean, although I sympathize with the concept, it may be a fleeting moment. If we get into this great power rivalries and intensified phase, military conflicts could take over. That's a sad part of international politics. When security becomes existential, there's another term I think he used, I agree with him. Countries can do a lot of things. They will engage in balancing more intensely. They will engage in proxy war. So existential conflict, the perception of existence, is very critical for balance of power. What kind of balance of power to emerge? So I think that is very critical to think about. And the actions each side undertake can generate that securitization into existential crisis. I think that's something that we need to think about a little bit more. Yeah, I think your categories are very useful, and in fact, for my revisions also, if you have published a paper on it in English, please send me. I'll be happy to cite it. Vinícius, your points, yes, you find definitely convergence between us, and non-alignment was, I think it was a necessary evil from the Western point of view. It was needed. These countries came out of colonial rule, and I'm actually a fan of Nehru in many ways. He made some mistakes, such as didn't do the economic policies that would have brought substantial progress, but he was inheriting a country with extreme poverty and weakness. But his vision was clearly these emerging states would not just fall into this bipolar order where they will again be subjugated to the whims of the great power system. He was very worried about a third world war, which if you lived in the 1950s, yes, it was a real possibility. And he did not want the emerging states to be part of it. They have a few achievements, which is the UN resolution on decolonization. That was their greatest achievement. The UN resolutions on, I have a book called Restraining Great Powers of Balancing in World Politics. You can look at their contribution in that sense. And secondly, the whole nuclear taboo tradition, they helped creating that. A number of little steps, institutional steps, a voice for the global south was there, G77, New International Economic Order. Not perfect, not successful, because they were not a military alliance. They were not an alliance. They were all issue-based, but they had some institutional structures. So the initial pace was definitely a creating new norms. Whatever the global south countries have today, in terms of the normative position in institutions, up to that moment, the Bantu moment, you can't just say the first time in human history, 50 countries, something like that, maybe less than that, sitting together and telling the great powers, do not dictate things to us. We have a position on these things. Never happened in human history, okay? You know the European great power system, the concert of Europe was 5 great powers in Vienna. None of these powers, other small states, including the Latin American countries where some of the independent were there. They did not treat them as equals. So now at least we have some positionality, and these countries are sought after to some extent. Of course, their trajectories are changing. This is where I think I agree with it. the growth patterns, ambitions. I mean, India is a good case. It was initially aspirational with Brazil and all, but now I think that the improvement in economic growth, I mean, I have this book coming out, giving them a lot of hope that there could be a pole next great power. There are many parameters are missing, but clearly the total growth is potentially going to be overtaking US. That's the latest 2075. Long time, I will be gone by then. But the point is, if it doesn't collapse with the economic and political crisis and massive environmental degradation, which is happening anyway. So there is ambition there. Whether it is possible, given the political, divisions created by populism and religious nationalism, all that is questionable. But the point is that we are in a cycle. These cycles happen in international politics. The world is never going to be peaceful in the perpetual peace Kantian world, unless, of course, everybody is democratic, everybody treats equal. This power problem, the status competition, the desire for the strongman syndrome that you address very, very, very rightly, all are there. And I think these cycles sometimes produce violent outbursts. Our aim should be to how to prevent that violent conflict from erupting again. And who is the most affected in violent conflicts? The ones in the pathway. The ones in the pathway are the Polands, the Baltic states, East Asia, the Southeast Asian countries. The small fry is the most suffering in great power conflicts. Look at the Cold War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Libya. It's the great powers often go there. It's a bit like Peloponnesian War. They have a tendency to behave in a way that don't care about this small fry. I think that's where the Global South has to emphasize the normative need, if at all. Of course, it's hard to create the institutional structures. They differ each other. They also have their little conflict among themselves, and they don't want any innovation. And the abject failure of the UN Security Council. It is not performing at all in facing any of the crises that we are witnessing. And actually, the General Assembly is little better, by the way, little better, I say. And that's where the Global South is united on some issues, not all of them. So we are so I am also reluctant to these binaries are difficult. It's a complex system, okay? Complexity has increased because of all the things that Professor Viola mentions about the technological changes. It's massive number of vectors and issue areas that entering the system, and ambitions of different actors, which is fine. The world can never be going back to this sort of typical bipolar or great power system. We will have a different system. That system will have some features, and it's in the interest of second-ranking states not to polarize it too much. That's my emphasis, which we have opportunities to cooperate and avoid the polarization. Polarization produces, first of all, extreme focus on military security, existential security, waste of money, uninterventionary wars, proxy wars. None of them is good. So how to protect the good aspects of globalization, but to protect how to make technology, especially AI and all, beneficial to this new rising world. These are all critical factors. And I think the lack of leadership is something that bothersome. Of course, global leadership. And even among the Western countries, I can't think of a single leader with that kind of vision as, let's say, Franklin Roosevelt or even Kennedy had to some extent. But anyway, I stop there.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments, Professor Paul. So now back to Professor Viola, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Paul. Yeah, you are right that our differences are not so strong that I say. This is a problem of my style of talking, that is exaggerating difference but for producing a good debate. Huh? has positive sides and negative sides. Okay. Well, in relation to why we are clearly in a Cold War, is that I think that since 2018, basically following Niall Ferguson, when in 2018 Niall Ferguson started to talk about the new Cold War and was almost isolated. Now, most internationalists think of the second Cold War. The one problem, China is not expansionist the way the Soviet Union was a sporting revolution, okay? Because of the beginning of the beginning of Russia is autocracy, very strong since 2018, when there was in January the election for the constitution, and the Bolsheviks didn't recognize the results. Okay, and afterwards the tradition is terrible. The whole idea of state terrorism was developed a lot by the Bolsheviks. Okay, and Trotsky particularly. So I think the Soviet Union is a totalitarian system since the Bolshevik Revolution, and it became less totalitarian after the Stalin death, but anyway continues being totalitarian until Gorbachev. The China expansion is different. It's not exporting revolution. It's exporting their model of governance, and this is intentionally said all over the world, that democracies are decadent, and the East-West, the East is rising, they see East is China, and the good governance, the good system is the Chinese system, that they call a kind of more meritocratic, okay? But it's not that, it was meritocratic until 2000, until Xi Jinping, but now it's much less meritocratic, okay? So China has another issue, that is empowered more and more the Communist Party. This is clear since Xi Jinping, okay? And so the global imperial intentions of China are stronger than the Soviet Union since the Second World War. So this is a reason, because they perceive mutually as existential threat, okay? And this is, for me, is key. The other thing that I don't agree with Professor Paul is in relation to the, can't say, well, the idea was gone now, but I will take. Yes, the military relationship between China and Russia. I think since the invasion of Ukraine, the military are cooperating much more. But remember, during Xi Jinping government, there were increasing amount of military exercise between China and Russia. Okay, this is very clear, and now we have a real alliance. It's not as strong as NATO, okay, but the previous history of rise of China's imperial vocation and the conflict with China because of the demographics, that is Siberia is almost an empty space and China is overpopulated. These differences are declining dramatically right now, and this is a reverse, because Russia is just a nuclear power. It's not even a military power significant. The Ukrainian war showed this. The military doctrine of Russia, coming from the Soviet Union, is centralization, a pyramidal structure of authority, like what the Japanese, the Germans in Europe during the Second World War. And the Western is clearly superior because it's the principle of decentralization. Okay? The autonomy of commanders, low commanders, to decide. Okay? That the Russians don't have. The other thing I would like to say is in relation to this is Vinícius about the question about the global south. It's true that in the global north, the difference between autocracies and democracies is very strong, and it's not the same in the global south. Okay, this is clear, and I agree completely that most countries in the global south, I'd say, they are and will be non-aligned. But the difference exists, is part of the real world. There are a lot of countries democratic, particularly Latin American in the global south, and a lot of autocracies, particularly in Africa and Asia. The last question in relation to Professor Paul is, I think there is leadership in the world. Biden is a major leader that is probably the strongest leader of a Western alliance and collective Western since the beginning of the Cold War. I know that you will be shocked by this statement, but this is my mistake. Okay. Okay, and so this is, I think Biden and the Democratic Party, like the European Union, have an excellent idea about how to produce peace. That is very difficult because of the different regimes. But the only way to reach peace, not completely, but major peace in the world would be when all the world will be democracies. Not all, but all the most important countries will be democracies. This was a perspective under Xi Jinping, okay? But this is not anymore a perspective.
Okay, thank you for your comments, please. Let's try to collect some questions from the audience, starting with Felipe. Yeah, like to introduce yourself. I can take the microphone to you. Yeah. Just a second. Yeah. Okay, you have that.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Felipe. I'm a Bachelor in International Relations and Economy by FAAP. And I have 3 questions that I wanted to ask. I hope they're short so we can have more time. But the first one is, when we talk about Cold War, here Cold War, it implies conflict, it implies war. So, and in regards to war, we've seen the escalation in Israel, and of course people are talking about China and Taiwan. I don't know, maybe India and Pakistan. I don't know if that would be a case now. But I wanted to know, if we were talking about Cold War, if these wars are going to happen, if you are certain that there are going to be more military conflicts other than Russia and Ukraine, if the international makeup of the world will change in the near future. The second one is more, well, with war, with conflicts, we usually see technological innovation and advancement. I wanted to know if you think that this will be a possibility, especially now, which is kind of combined. The world is trying to innovate to not need the fuel and energy resources that pollute the world, but now we are at war. Well, parts of the world are at war, and that does pollute a lot. And so I would like to know if we're gonna try to have a green war in some case, trying if pollution is going to be in the mind of the countries while in conflict, or as I think most probable, that's gonna be out the window. And thirdly, if you think that international organizations are going to survive this Cold War, or if they're going to change, like the UN Security Council, with Russia being part of it now, and the situation as it is isn't being proved very efficient. And if other multipolar international international organizations will survive this new world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. I suggest that we answer each question, so I think it's easier. Or more if the speakers prefer. More questions this far? Not at this stage, so okay, so you can answer.
Yeah, the notion of Cold War implies no hot war between big powers. That's the understanding. So Cold War, we can have regional Cold Wars too, but the possibility of war exists, which means they're preparing for war, they're not shooting at each other. That means you can have an intense rivalry, you can have a lot of arms race, you can have policies that produce hostility, a lot of characteristics. But a hot war means what is happening in Ukraine and Russia, active use of military force. So this is also connected to the notion of stability. Stability is when great powers, Osgood's idea, are not in intense shooting war, but doesn't mean that they are friends. They have active military planning going on, preparation for war, and they act like they are existential enemies. And I think that is a big difference between other forms are there. Cold peace, you can have less military violence. Then you can have deep peace or perpetual peace. That's the idea of Immanuel Kant's idea that everybody is democratic, everybody gets a voice, etc. So I think whether we are entering that phase of hot war, well, we're already witnessing that part of it in Europe. But if the war escalates to other states, or if it becomes a major conflagration, the chances of that are low because this is where I still think, Professor Viola, the Chinese are not going to jump into the bandwagon as quickly as we think, because a war is not going to help them at all. In Europe, for instance, they need the European states, they need the United States, they need the war means they cannot send their products. And so they have a great incentive to avoid anything short of active escalation. And they are making some moves, not as very strong as they should be. And so this is actually a cushioning factor, whether we like it or not. It's the fact that they have, but at the same time, in this conflict, they don't want Russia to lose. By the way, that is a dimension that we forget. Even the global south countries, such as India, want Russia as a pole. Russia has been a very useful partner for countries like India, I don't know, Brazil, but clearly there are 7 vetoes that Russia did in the Security Council whenever there is India-Pakistan conflict, all in favor of India. The Western countries are pushing India in a very different direction, 71 war in particular. So if the West is joined against some of these countries, where else they go? And that is Russia. So Russia is gone. They fear that the Western arrogance or Western determination to dominate the world will only increase. These are the self-interested calculations of states. And we sitting outside and say, okay, you're not good, you're not democratic. Yeah, because the West has a history of dominance, domination, and imperialism. which it can resurrect in the name of liberal democracy, although liberalism has a lot of plus things. I mean, one doesn't want to say liberalism is a wrong ideology, but liberalism can be imperial, okay? And when it becomes imperial, it gets extreme violence, as it did after the end of the Cold War, the US wars, without even a pretext sometimes. So there are a lot of these fears that, but at the same time, they need the West too. That's why they are forming these Quad and different alliances at this point. They are not alliances; they are strategic partnerships. Yeah, the big question you raised, this AI thing, is, I don't know if you watch television every day. There's a recent interview in 60 Minutes and GPS and all with what Google is developing. It's actually scary. Chat GTP to whatnot. Next 10 years, they're predicting things will happen dramatically quickly. And what is the military implications? Whether we will have technologies that allow some countries' dominance, as tanks and aircraft did during the First World War and Second World War, the Blitzkrieg. The grand strategies change when you have the capacity to use those capabilities. So, big question mark whether this technology will be militarized globally and some will emerge very powerful. Whether little non-human soldiers will engage in warfare that because of the expectation that there is no casualty, because countries are casualty sensitive, as we know. So a lot of those things, and what will happen to the outer space competition, I don't know, imponderables. International organizations, yes. But you notice that all these organizations, the new ones in particular, informal, they meet often. G20, there is, I don't know anybody been to India. Modi is really using it in a big way. Every corner there is a picture of him and G20 for domestic reasons, of course. There is SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and all the ASEAN meetings, BRICS, they all want to be there. The question is, why do they come for these meetings? I think they are totally useless. There's some benefit in informal exchanges and even some agreements, but they are not formal and structured. UN forums, some of the affiliated groups are doing well. Even WHO, that despite all its problems, but WTO, as maybe you can help us, is in decline, but it is a needed forum that's been used for this arbitration mechanism and dispute settlement mechanisms. Increasingly, even great powers sometimes follow their orders or their decisions. So whether the same organizations will survive, in the history of international organizations, that some survive, some fail. It's like states. The death rate is there. Often death happens as a result of great power conflicts, and they don't want to support any of these institutions. So the Security Council is a total disaster, as I said, because great powers are not even talking to each other. They have to have some agreement on each other's position. The problem is the West thinks that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. It should behave like a defeated party. And the Russians don't think that way. And that's a status problem. And it's getting worse because you have this aggression in Ukraine is producing more and more Western cohesion. And Russia is being boxed in. And that's a status boxing in. And I just worry that the Russians will go into a very difficult nationalism phase, maybe internal conflicts. Maybe a Gorbachev type person will emerge in that conflict. But the change has to happen internally. Putin must go for that. And that is, we cannot predict. Russia had all that history in the past. So I think a lot to do with this unwillingness. I mean, this is where even though Mr. Biden has tried to support some, but I think there is a cold warrior in him. He's using the same techniques that the US used during the actual Cold War, where he was a big participant. And like the use of the cluster bomb, I personally think it was a mistake. Whatever little expediency, military benefit you get, these norms are good for the Western and the world. So even if they do good things, they can be really hurt by these little decisions, I think there's a lot of pressure on them because they're not winning the war as they hoped to end the war quickly. But ending the war quickly would mean massive use of force with no guarantee. The Russians have a lot of capacity, hardware. They may not have enough forces to fight at this point, but they are not going to give up easily. They are a great power in their mind. If they give up, their existential security will be gone. So not that we want to justify the aggression, but it's very hard not to see from their point of view. They made a mistake, yes. But how to extricate from them that mistake? I think it's high time we think about that. How to get them out of it, and that's the question. Thank you.
Okay. So, there's many thanks, Felipe, for your question. So, the about I agree with Professor Paul about the definition of what is Cold War, but we are now in a Cold War with a hot war. NATO is at war with Russia. Okay, this is no. See, obviously the West didn't say that. Okay, but it's at war and is using all the technologies they can, all the support, the intelligence, satellites, and so on to Ukraine, even private, like the Elon Musk support satellite communications. So we are in a situation similar but more risky than the Korean War, okay? Because the Korean War was still when the US has clear nuclear superiority. This is not the case today. So the second point is technological innovation. I think there is a lot of technological innovation in war. The Ukrainian war has, The Economist published last week a dossier about the new way of war. It's very, very good. I recommend you to read it. Okay, it's The Economist from the last week. Today is will be published this week. And about the survival of international organization. Yes, they will survive. This is the logic, because it's very difficult to finish an organization. There are a lot of vested interests, but their importance will decline significantly. Already has declined. I mean, for example, the World Trade Organization, the climate change regime, for example, that is has not accomplished what it proposed in the Rio conference in 1992, and it's difficult. Though in climate change, now China and United States, China doesn't want to cooperate in climate change with United States, and the condition they put is that they have a more complacent acceptation of China. But about new, more recent organization, I agree. I think the BRICS is doomed, okay, because of the confrontation between China and India. Okay, so but it will continue, even will expand. Okay, but this is an area in which the BRICS are directly shaped by the Cold War. Okay, and this is more or less the last thing I would like to say. I don't know if Vinícius will come back. Is that I don't agree, Vinícius. Just a point that I didn't comment originally. I don't agree with you about the possibility of de-dollarization of the global economy. Okay, I see today de-dollarization of the global trade. Today, the 50% of the global trade is in dollars, 30% or 20 is about euros. Also, we have the sterling and the yen. Okay, and China, the yuan comes after this. It's just 3-4%. So the dollarization will be a long-term dynamic, but probably, but not short or middle-term dynamic. Thank you.
Just a remark, thank you for your comments. We are collecting more questions, but now who's going to take mediation is Professor Elizabeth Balbachevsky. Okay, so she will be collecting the questions. Thank you. I'll be back at the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? Yes.
Hello, good morning. My name is Daniel. I'm a undergrad student of international relations at FGV. And I wanted to ask about what you both said about Russia and how Viola said specifically about how after 2021 to 2022, the world went from a multipolar order to a more bipolar order. And I think that this might be tied to how Russia behave and the current situation that they have in Ukraine. The war most likely lasted way longer than they predicted when they started the war. I think that they imagined that it would be a very fast war. They even tried to invade Ukraine through Kiev and take the capital, this kind of decapitation tactic. But it started to be a very hard war, a war of attrition. And Mr. Paul even mentioned that this could be a new Afghanistan and last for up to 10 years. But during the NATO summit that just happened, some American military command mentioned that Russia, although Russia is suffering heavy losses of infantry and tanks and mechanized trucks and things like that, their Navy and their Air Force are still very much intact from the war. And this American general, I think it is the one in command of the European command of the USA. He mentioned that they are creating a plan to defend Europe because they should see Russia as a threat. And my question is more like, what comes after the Ukraine war, and how do you think things will be, especially considering that Russia is gaining a lot of military experience, actual military experience in this war, which is lacking for European, not so much for American command, but a very modern and big war that, at least in my lifetime, I don't remember seeing before. And do you think this might lead to a more working Russian command, such as, just an example, like what came after the Second World War and General MacArthur and his positions on the Korean War and how he wanted to use nuclear weapons? Can like this situation in Ukraine lead to this sort of measurement by those military leaders in Russia? Thank you.
Okay, Professor Paul.
Yeah, a lot of it is hypothetical situation. One thing is very clear: Russia is benefiting from so-called nuclear deterrence, that the West cannot escalate. So that's the problem of Ukraine joining NATO, because there's Article 5, whereby the West, NATO is supposed to come to Ukraine's help directly. So it becomes a proxy war for the West. And in that proxy war, the Afghan example is quite similar, interesting, because that was also a proxy war, but there, United States, with the help of Pakistan and Mujahideen, engaged in active guerrilla warfare type of operations. Eventually, the Soviets had to give up. But notice there was a regime change in Russia or Soviet Union. It was arrival of Gorbachev happened partly a result of this Afghan situation. Now that can happen in Russia, and then the Russians trying to withdraw from this conflict. So what would be a peace settlement that would look like? I think it will be a neutral Ukraine, like what Austria was during Cold War period. If there is some kind of a peace, unless of course Russia is weakened considerably and that they will have no choice but to accept the Western terms and conditions. Sometimes this can happen, by the way. Afghan withdrawal was an example. They withdrew completely and there was nothing left for them there. So, but this is not Afghanistan in one big difference. It is next door, and it's culturally, ethnically, all Russians think this is their territory, sphere of influence, a core sphere of influence. And I think that's Afghanistan was never a core sphere of influence. So I think it is, even if the West win this time, unless there is some kind of a institutional structure to prevent more conflicts, we have a problem. I think the idea that NATO can prevent war eternally is questionable, because you can have a lot of stability, instability conditions. You know, Russians can support a lot of groups on those Russian-dominated areas, and they can continue this conflict in some fashion, even if there is general truce or end of conflict. So that is not stability. That's not peace. That's unstable order. Maybe the main war could end, but some settlement needs to be thought about, whereby use of these non-strategic warfare or sub-strategic warfare does not continue, because that's what kill people. That's what make life impossible for those who live there. You know, that's what we think about. Refugees all come out of that. So Russia is a question mark. Russian history is one of this successful adaptation, failures, massive internal challenges, territorial displacements, a nation state that tried to absorb a lot of other nationalities, failed in that, but a lot of brutality in between to themselves. You know, the Ukrainians themselves have a memory of that during the Stalin era. How to make that state a normal state? I think it is a big question mark, whether they have the capacity to become a normal, because democracy does not appear to be there in the DNA. It's very much, but I think we have to look at their desire to be respected as big power, as a great power. And I talked to many people. This is more important than anything else for average Russian. It's from the Peter the Great onwards. You are a great people, great nation. And if somebody challenges that, we will fight you. You know, that's the attitude. So status, international status, is more than we think. And I think the current move of the West is to deny them, calling them a gas tank or stuff like that. It really upsets them. No? They want a seat on the table. They want to be respected. The problem is the liberal order looks at them as a rogue state, as it was discussed here. They are not with us. The liberals think unless you are a liberal, you are not co-equal. You're illiberal. You're authoritarian. You know, you're not good enough. I think we are facing that psychological warfare in this case.
Okay, Professor Viola.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for your question. first, one thing that called my attention was that the learning, potential learning of Russia in the war. Okay, I don't think this is easy because it's the way of war of the West that is decentralized is based in democratic political regimes. So an autocratic power that is almost totalitarian right now has this adopting the Western way of war. Okay, is very, very difficult because you need to change the political regime. Okay, and this is like not wait to happen in the near future or even in the middle term. The democratic opposition was strong in Russia before the whole repression of 2012 was a very crucial year for the democratic opposition in Russia. That shows have been showing a lot of power. But this, the repression of the third and fourth presidents of Putin has going stronger and stronger, and particularly since the invasion of Ukraine. Okay, so this is the way. This is because I am skeptical about the potential for. Of course, there will be learning. Even there is learning now compared with the first part of the war. Okay, but not in dramatic shift. Okay? So the other thing that I would like to comment is about Professor Paul. That is, I think the Ukraine will not be neutral, will be an ally of the West. This is already happening because entering NATO Biden and the Germans don't want. Okay, but in the Vilnius summit of NATO, that this has been probably the most important after the foundation of NATO. Okay, so because of the modernization of defense industry, increasing military budget, the whole modernization of the military equipment, all these, the more integration. Now, the NATO approach is that they will have 300,000 troops in high rate. This is something like the First Cold War. Okay, very different from what is in the Ukrainian war that was 50,000 high rate. So I think this support an alliance between the G7 and of course adding Poland, for example, and the Baltic states in relation to Russia is very important for forecasting, in my opinion, that Ukraine will not be neutral, though it's true that there will be a stalemate, a long war, even with some tregua. No, I don't know. Tregua. Tregua. How do you say in English? Okay, but you all understand. And so the war is going to be continued. I think the support of the NATO will continue even if Trump is elected in 2024. Why? Because more than a half of the Republicans in the House and in the Senate are strongly in favor of supporting Ukraine. And so even there will be probably an appropriation of multi-year budget for supporting Ukraine. next year, or even at the end of this year, in order to impede, in order to avoid that Trump could change significantly the position in the Ukrainian war. Of course, he will like to change dramatically, but all the evidences is that this is not going to happen, though there will be some reduction in Trump. But the second point that I think is Biden will likely win re-election, okay? Because of many reasons, particularly because the swing voters and the moderate Republicans vote that will not vote for Trump this time.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? Is there any question from online? The problem is that many people don't use this. No. So I have a question by myself. In fact, I have two questions. First of all, there is a lot of talking about the gains from the past Cold War about the non-aligned countries. But if you look at the experience, in fact, the countries that the middle income countries that most gain in the last Cold War was the ones that aligned with the United States. For instance, South Korea, for instance, well, Indonesia, for instance, Taiwan. Why? Because I think that because they were, well, close supporters of the United States opened their market to these countries, and these countries, to a certain degree, they profited from the access to the market, to the United States market, the dynamics, the technological dynamics that goes on inside that market. I think that the non-allied, we can have any other country that were strongly known, that were, it's not work. Yeah, that were not aligned, that profit as that. Do you think that something like that could happen now? This is one question. The other question is regarding this. Well, could we say that Ukraine would be the Vietnam for the Vietnam experience for Russia? You were saying about the Afghanistan. Well, maybe, but something that really had a very strong impact. And the other thing, I think it's more for you, Viola. This technological change, if it really happens with the degree that we are supposing that we are seeing to happen, could it change the balance of powers? Because, for instance, new technologies based on new energies, new sources of energy made, for example, Russia gas less important for Europe and things like that. So how this, the impact of the technology, the green technology, could have in the balance of the world power. So
Yeah, very good questions. I agree that a few countries did benefit during the Cold War by aligning. Japan first, Korea next, Taiwan, small countries, of course. Then some of the ASEAN countries, Singapore and all that, Indonesia. By the way, Indonesia was also non-aligned, supposedly not clear it was that aligned. But then you have a lot of failures. The Philippines, you have Pakistan. In fact, I wrote a book about it, this geostrategic curse. If you don't have the internal change regime with a plan of action. You know, this notion of developmental states, and something to offer a workforce, technology, and a strategy. You know, the Japan case, the MITI, the Ministry of Industry and International Cooperation. The Koreans adapting and improving the social conditions, you know, the whole idea of the developmental state. Other countries did not do that and would not have done that. Okay, this is the thing we need to remember. Countries like India, for instance, huge country, and it would have polarized India because of internal domestic issues. So it has a domestic component to way to keep peace within among different ideological groups. And there is no guarantee that the United States would have opened up the market to all these countries, even if all of them joined. The United States used selectively some places where they would supply chains, you know, allow them. That doesn't affect American hegemony. American hegemony was still dominant. And then the stationing of military US forces. The other countries would not have approved for security reasons and exacerbating the conflict with the Soviet Union. So it's a mixed bag, and you have these examples, and you have some bad examples too of US strategic curse, if I want to call that term. Well, right now the Indian strategy is a little bit like these countries. Be friend to the United States, gain as much market access, especially in the new technologies that they are trying to exit from China. So they are using that, and India is benefiting. The trade between the two are increasing. A lot of companies are moving to India. How sustainable it is? It all depends whether India can really become a developmental state, which would mean the workforce strain. Right now there is a decent workforce, but it's not globally, you know, competitive. When they come outside, they come to the US, they do become global. But within India, there are a lot of constraints in that educational system. Because of the size, it does produce it. 10% is enough for this kind of competition. It's huge, you know, if you look at the engineering colleges all around India. So the demographic dividend of India is part of that benefit. I think for that reason alone, India would like to remain close to the US, but not a military ally. But the one condition that could change is a major escalation in the Himalayas. The Chinese starting a war, and India would have to resist. And there is nothing that India would want other than that would produce an alliance with the United States. So I think there are a lot of conditions there. The US also realized that it's useful to have these big demographic for immigration, for technology, for market access. So the US is willing to forego the illiberal policies of the current regime there. And so there are a few countries that are benefiting the current environment. More alignment, and the problem is the US has now a lot of resistance to a lot of protectionism, as you know, because of China's rise and the spread of industries to these countries, and middle class America losing that economic force they had. So there is a transformation that globalization brought, and it was mentioned that the China thing was the big mistake they did. I don't know, mistake in the sense it benefited them too. They are not abandoning it. If it's not beneficial to them, why can't they abandon the China trade? Because they do get a lot of goods. Go to Walmarts of the world. It's that cheap thing that keeps the population satisfied reasonably, that they get everything they want, you know. But it's, of course, it produces externalities, produces a lot of political and other geopolitical challenges which they could not forecast. By the way, the expectation is actually a very liberal modernization theory, simple modernization theory. Once China becomes modernized, the middle class will demand democracy and freedom. Now that is being shown that's not always the case. People are sometimes more attached to nation, religion, ethnicity, a strong leader giving all these promises, a lot of things. Democracy also failed in many of the so-called liberal states. The American model, by the way, is not a globally like model anymore. It has produced Trumps and the kind of vicious conflict they produce, and the kind of rich people get away with murder, you know, that kind of stuff. And the inequality, extreme inequalities. You know, it's sad to see this country had a lot of greatness. You go to San Francisco today, you know, this is a scary place, and it shouldn't be like that. A lot of homeless, you know, without a cushion for the poor, and the largest number of people in the prison for younger generation per capita. All these are, people look at it as, is this a model? You know, it has some models, yes, innovative universities and ideas, but even infrastructure, the Chinese trains now go 400 kilometer speed. It's scary. How can they do that fast? So a lot of things. I think where it will, I'm still not giving up on liberal order, liberal world, because what do humans want? Okay, you can have all the material things, but people inherently want some freedom, choices, and that process is still going on. And that the liberal idea has, despite all its problems with hegemony, with racism and all that, has got this germane of, you know, you are equal to others. You know, there's that movement is also going on, and that is sort of the liberal hope. And democracy failing and these authoritarian models. By the way, there was mention of China's desire that their model will become global. I don't think a single country has adopted. Well, they adopted the Singapore, some of those models themselves, Deng Xiaoping. But other than Cambodia, which was already a communist state, Vietnam, but already a state. It's not that it's becoming globally acceptable, because there's a lot of conditions that make China what China is. The ethnic conceptions, you know, the unity and all that. Most countries don't have those preconditions. And so the Chinese model, well, people look at it as amazingly, okay, you're doing so well, but then when they start implementing it at home, can't see any example of success. The so-called authoritarian states. There will be a lot of turnover of authoritarians and populists who fail eventually, and then people want more democracy. So it's cyclical to some extent. Ukraine is a Vietnam for Russia. More like, yeah, and I think the difference is the United States could just withdraw from Vietnam and no major consequences other than the population coming in for settlement. The suffering was for the region, you know. But that's not this. This is the next door, and it's your core sphere of influence. So the big difference is that how can they afford it to go? But although they let many of their 15 republics go, whether this will be that kind of a going is the question mark. By the way, very few great powers wars have produced abject victory for them in the post-war period. Korea, we mentioned, draw, pre-war condition, you know, no peace, all that bloodshed. Vietnam, great power lost. Don't want to accept that. Afghanistan, great power is lost twice. Algeria, great power lost again. Which is the war that the United States has won? Panama and don't make me laugh. I mean, these are not wars. These are just a little operation, you know. Even the war in Lebanon, in Libya, in Syria right now, the great powers are not winning. India went into, it's not a great power, went into Sri Lanka and withdrew. Israel, Lebanon withdrew. Why is that so? The power of nationalism is so powerful, it's impossible to dominate the people too long if they want to resist. So the Ukrainians will resist, I think. And the resistance will produce periodic violent outbursts from Russia. And the expectation is that it will be a drawn out long war. You made actually a very good point, which is the great powers, actually most states enter wars expecting short wars. There are books about it from World War I, the short war illusion. I think short war is the only one that they can justify to their military commanders and their people. This war will be quick. Let's go in and get out. Therefore, let's start. But only when the war starts, they realize that quick war disappears. Short war illusion. And I think that is an illusion that we need to study more and more. Why do they get into this short war trap? This is because a narrow group of military people with not a long horizon and learning dysfunctionally are doing this business of warfare. And we think they are very superior in their intellect and their capacity, but they are not. I keep telling people that we should stop worshipping the great power leaders, in particular, their cliques. They're like Tilly's idea of security racketeers. This word sounds strong, but it's really racketeering is going on, which is you create a lot of problems. Charles Tilly's idea of domestic racket. Police forces create racketeering. And then you are called to prevent more violence, order maintenance, and this cycle perpetuates. And it's in the interest of the racketeer, benefits. So we need to stop worshipping great power behavior. They are needed, but they are also a problem. Of course, can you get rid of the problem? No, because the power differential and all the things that realists talk about. But we can restrain them, mellow them, and that's where institutions come, ideas, norms, etc.
Okay, just brief response. By the way, Professor Paul, the word I couldn't remember was a ceasefire. Okay? Because I say tregua. No podemos we can say also cessation de fuego. Okay, green technologies. Los technological change, for sure, in relation to green technology, this is against Russia, no doubt. But though Russia could go also developing green energy because they have a lot of potential for hydropower. So, and even potential for wind power and solar power, solar and less. So, and even biomass. This will imply significant change. In relation to the impact of technological transformations on China, the major question is the following: that if China continues with recentralization and concentration of power in Xi Jinping, what is happening is that the autonomy of corporations, and particularly high-tech corporations, has been diminished dramatically and will continue being diminished. And a major point from this is that the key for any other thing for China is to keep as strong, very strongly, the Communist Party monopoly in power. This is the issue. No, it's not a global expansion. It's also very relevant, but it's secondary to keep the monopoly of, because they had learned a lot about the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev. They are always saying how not to do like the Soviets in the second half of the 80s. Okay, so I think this could change because, of course, I mean, the idea of being significantly surpassed by the United States in artificial intelligence, for example, is a threat for China. Okay, but now the most important frontier of artificial intelligence is generative artificial intelligence, and also deep learning. But in deep learning, the Chinese are the same level than United States. But in generative, so far, okay, the vanguard has been the United States. Okay, and it's very difficult to produce equivalent generative artificial intelligence because there is no freedom in China. So always filter, and how do you use the whole knowledge in the internet without having the control of Communist Party. And this is not revolution. So I think in relation to green technologies in China, in the future, let's say starting in the 30s, they will go to a path of decarbonization, not rapid necessarily, but so they have this infrastructure for the deployment of green technology. And also, it's not green, but it's low carbon, nuclear. They are producing right now, they are contracting like 30 new nuclear power and in a scale that is not the previous experience of the world. Each model is the same and simultaneously for 5, 6 reactors. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we finished our session now. And thank you for your attendance.
Very much. It was very, very interesting and informative. I gained a lot from this discussion. Actually, it's good to engage and agree and disagree. Some of this it's in progress. This is rather new, this new Cold War, and so it could turn different directions. By the way, we are forgetting that you can have domestic changes in Russia, China, United States, everywhere. So we are already witnessing that. And those changes, different leaders with visions could arise, and that depends who will win that coalition. So I think we will continue this conversation for the next 100 years.